All right, good morning, everyone. We'll call the meeting of the Coastal Pelagics Management Board to order. For those of you online, this is Spud Woodward, Georgia's Governor's appointee commissioner and current chair of the board. Our first item on our agenda is approval of the agenda. Are there any recommended modifications or additions to the agenda? Any online? Probably not. Don't see any in the room. Okay, we'll consider the agenda approved by unanimous consent. You also have the proceedings from our January 2024 meeting in the briefing materials. Are there any edits, corrections, or additions to the proceedings? Don't see any hands raised in the room. Anyone online with any? All right, we'll consider those accepted by unanimous consent as well. Next item is public comment. I know we have one person online, Thomas Newman, that wishes to make a public comment. I assume this is about items that are not on the agenda. So Thomas, I'm going to call on you.
Yeah, my name is Thomas Newman. I want to make a comment about Spanish mackerel. I'm a North Carolina commercial fisherman. I also work part-time at North Carolina Fisheries Association. And I'm also on the mackerel cobia advisory panel for the South Atlantic. But I just wanted to stress the importance of this fisheries to our state, especially. Like I say, we're making everything work right now. And before we do any hard and fast changes, we need to take our time and look at this and do the right thing. And also, I talked with Mr. Batsavage earlier last week. And although 374 fishermen in our state catch Spanish mackerel, they're all over our state for 6 to 8 months out of the year. There's really just a few core communities that really depend on this fish. A few dozen fishermen, less than 50, that depend on this fish to make their majority of their yearly income. And it's a very, very important fish for our state and for our commercial fishermen. And I just, as this process goes along, I will be involved, and I hope anyone here on the board can reach out and contact me if they need anything. But I appreciate you guys' time and for looking at this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Is there anyone in the room that would like to make a comment about anything on our board agenda? Don't see any hands. Then we'll move along. Our next agenda item is an action item, and that is to consider approval of Atlantic Cobia Draft Addendum 2, which is on recreational allocation, harvest target evaluation, and measure setting. So for public comment. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily to walk us through. I want to make sure we take our time and we do this deliberatively, and everybody is comfortable with the final product of this. So we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll review the timeline for the addendum and also the current management process to get started, because I think that's helpful context. And then I will get into the statement of the problem and the management options. I'll also highlight some points from the plan development team. The PDT submitted a memo in your materials as well, so I'll note those in red throughout the presentation. And as a reminder, as the chair stated, this is a board action for consideration to potentially approve this document for public comment today. So the board initiated this addendum in October of last year to address recreational reallocation using more recent harvest data, and also to consider alternatives to the current state-by-state management framework. And then most recently at the last meeting, the board did provide some additional guidance to add some options addressing future updates to allocations, to consider uncertainty, and also the timeline for setting measures. So based on that additional board guidance in January, the PDT developed the draft document, which you have in front of you today. So the board is considering approving that draft addendum for public comment today. And if it is approved, we would conduct public hearings and the public comment period this summer. And then the board could review the public comment and select final management options at the next meeting in August. So just a brief review of the current recreational management process regarding allocations and harvest target evaluations. So the board can set the total harvest quota for cobia for both sectors for up to 3 years. And 96% of that quota is allocated to the recreational sector, 4% to the commercial sector. And then that recreational portion of the quota is then allocated further to the non-de minimis states. So that's Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And then there's a 1% set aside for de minimis states. And then those allocations are based on the state's historical landings, with 50% based on landings from 2006 to 2015, and then 50% based on landings from 2011 to 2015. And then those allocation percentages are used to calculate a soft harvest target for each of those non-de minimis states. So then for those states with soft targets, the realized harvest is evaluated against those soft targets every time the board sets the total harvest quota. So that's up to every 3 years or sometimes more frequently. So to do that evaluation, we take an average of up to 3 years of harvest that have been under the same set of recreational management measures. And if a state's average harvest exceeds their target, that state must adjust their measures to reduce back down to their target. If a state's harvest has been less than their target for 2 consecutive years, then the state can choose to liberalize measures to reach their target. And then any changes to measures have to be reviewed by the TC and approved by the board. So most recently, last year, the board set the total harvest quota for 2024 to 2026. And then we did conduct an evaluation of state average harvest for the years 2021 and 2022 and compared that to the state harvest targets. However, based on some TC analysis and recommendations, the board decided to actually maintain status quo state management measures for this year, 2024, instead of requiring reductions for states that exceeded their targets. So essentially, this new addendum the board discussed is intended to dictate what will happen in 2025. So what the allocation framework will look like and going through that evaluation process, which might include updated harvest targets depending on the outcome of this addendum. So in addition to having this addendum to determine what happens next year, we also have the upcoming stock assessment, which is just getting started. That's CDR 95, and we anticipate that stock assessment will be available to inform management in either 2026 or 2027, depending on exactly when we get the assessment results. So sort of a lot to think about coming up the next few years. So getting into the statement of the problem for this draft addendum, the original interstate FMP established these state-by-state allocations, and then Amendment 1 in 2019 updated those allocations to add that de minimis set-aside of 1%. And those allocations are based on data, as I mentioned, from 2015, but the distribution of cobia recreational landings has changed since 2015. We've seen an increase in some mid-Atlantic states, but landings have been relatively stable in many of the southern states. So this indicates more of a range expansion versus a range shift. And we also had Rhode Island and New York declare into the fishery recently due to the increasing presence of cobia in their state waters. So updating the allocation data timeframe used for cobia would account for these changes in landings that we've been seeing. Originally, the state-by-state allocation framework was implemented to provide flexibility to the states. However, there's concerns that the MRIP estimates for cobia have very high PSEs because it's a pulse rare event fishery. And there's also concerns about using these highly uncertain state estimates to continue to evaluate performance and make management changes at the state level. So one way to reduce that uncertainty is to potentially increase the sample size by switching to a regional or coast-wide allocation framework. Uncertainty with these harvest estimates could also be addressed by thinking about how many years we're including in our average when we do these evaluations, whether to use point estimates or not, and also whether a state or region's performance should be considered on its own or should also take into account the performance of other states or regions. Additionally, we know that allocation percentages may need to be updated in the future, and there's a few potential scenarios. One is if a current de minimis state loses their de minimis status, that means that de minimis state would have to be factored into the allocation calculation and get their own harvest target. So if that happens, all of the allocation percentages will need to be updated. And then the percentages might also need to be updated if MRIP updates their harvest estimates based on the work that they're doing right now to look into the bias in some of their estimates. So if future updates to these allocation percentages are considered through our typical addendum process, those updates could take several months. But if the board could make those updates via board action or a board vote, those updates could be accomplished more quickly. And there's also been a concern about changing measures too frequently for the cobia fishery. So right now the board can set the total harvest quota for up to 3 years. And there was discussion about to avoid management whiplash and changing those measures frequently, the board could consider setting specifications for a longer period of time. So I will get into the management options for this draft addendum. Again, a huge thanks to the plan development team. We had a great team working on this, and it's also been a joint effort on the staff end between myself and Chelsea. So there are 5 sections in the management option portion. So I'll just go section by section in terms of the options here. So section 3.1 is the allocation framework itself. So this section considers both how the quota is allocated on a geographic scale, so either state by state, regional, or coast-wide. And then it also considers the data timeframes as the basis for allocation. So status quo, we have the weighted timeframes, 50% based on 2006 to 2015 landings, 50% based on 2011 to 2015, that's our status quo. The alternative timeframes to consider here would be basing allocation on 2018 to 2023, or we have 2 additional weighted options. So 50% based on 2014 to 2023, so the previous 10 years, and then 50% based on 2018 to 2023, so the previous 6 years, or a weighted combination of that 10-year time span plus the most recent 3 years, 2021 to 23. Just a note that 2016 and 2017 are excluded from these allocation calculations due to fishery closures, and 2020 is also excluded due to the COVID-19 impacts on MRIP. And just to clarify in the draft addendum, it's inconsistent in some places right now. It's a 2018 to 2023 is a 6-year time span, but we have 5 years of data. 2014 to 2023 is a 10-year time span, but we have 7 years of data. So if this addendum is approved for public comment, we'll make sure that that is clear in the addendum. And just also a note before I go any further, the final MRIP estimates for 2023 are now available. The addendum was drafted with preliminary estimates because that's what we had at the time, but there were very minor updates to the cobia harvest estimates. Some of the allocation percentages changed by less than 0.01%, so not much change with the final MRIP data for this year. So getting into the specific options about how the quota could be allocated on the geographic scale and the time frames, we start with our status quo, of course, option A, state-by-state allocation with our 2006 to 2015 data. Option B would be continuing with a state-by-state allocation, but the allocations could be updated to either of the 3 alternative timeframes that I mentioned. So either the past 6 years, the combination of the past 10 years and the past 6 years, or the combination of the past 10 years and the past 3 years. And then for the updated state-by-state allocations, the de minimis set-aside would increase to 5%, and that would be to account for the increased landings that we've seen across de minimis states over the past few years. So status quo, we only have a 1% de minimis set aside, but the PDT noted that landings have increased and that 5% would better account for those de minimis landings. So here's the table. This is the same one in the addendum, but essentially you can see that the first column is option A, status quo. And then for all of the alternatives, you see a lot of the quota with the updated data would shift up to the mid-Atlantic. North Carolina's quota would decrease, and then South Carolina and Georgia's would also decrease a little bit. So the PDT notes that these changes to the state allocations based on these updated data are pretty significant. It results in a pretty significant change for some states. And again, the magnitude of these changes are primarily driven by Virginia's increased proportion of the harvest in recent years and North Carolina's decreased proportion of the harvest in recent years. The PDT did talk about, because these are significant changes, whether or not to phase in these changes, but the PDT determined that this would result in, constantly changing targets and measures from year to year. So the PDT wouldn't recommend doing any sort of phase-in approach. But the PDT does recognize that these would be pretty significant changes. So the next option after the state-by-state options would be a regional allocation option. So there are options in the addendum for 4 different regional breakdowns, including options for either a 2-region approach or a 3-region approach. The PDT does recommend a 2-region approach. The PDT is recommending that the board remove the 3-region options because 3 regions would result in having a northern region that's just several de minimis states, and those de minimis states would have less than 2% of the allocation. Their landings are really variable and they have really high PSEs. So the PDT would recommend just removing the 3-region approach and considering 2 regions. The other point to consider is where to draw the line between regions. And a question from the PDT is, should North Carolina be grouped with Virginia and states northward, or should North Carolina be grouped with South Carolina and Georgia? So previously, there's been some tagging data that indicate that Virginia and North Carolina represent the same group of fish, and so that could be a rationale to group Virginia and North Carolina together. However, the PDT noted that when you're looking at the timing of harvest throughout the year, North Carolina's peak harvest tends to more closely align with South Carolina and Georgia's harvest, so that could be a rationale to group North Carolina with South Carolina and Georgia. So the PDT recommends, if the board does have a preference at this point for these regional groupings, the board could consider removing some of the other options. And then, of course, these regional allocations would consider the same 3 timeframes that I've mentioned for the other options. So the goal with these regional allocations is to eventually establish a consistent region-wide size and vessel limit, but the seasons could still vary among states, noting that, depending on cobia availability, the seasons might be different from state to state. So measures in each state, if the board went with a regional allocation, would remain status quo until either that region needs to take a reduction or until the next stock assessment, when likely things will change. So once one of those things happens, either the region needs a reduction or we have the next stock assessment, then the board would consider how to come up with a region-wide consistent size and vessel limit. So these tables are the same ones that are in the draft addendum. I'll just highlight on this slide. These are the options for the southern region, which would be just South Carolina and Georgia. So for the 2-region breakdown, you'd have Virginia North would have somewhere between 84 and 87% of the quota. South Carolina and Georgia would have between 12 and 16%. And then if you have that 3-region breakdown, you add that very northern region that would have less than 2% of the quota. So this slide, again, this is in the draft addendum, shows the options for if you have a southern region with North Carolina grouped with South Carolina and Georgia. So in that instance, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia would have between 26 and 33% of the quota. And then Virginia North would have somewhere between 67 and 74% of the quota. So after the regional allocation option, we move to option D, and this is just the coastwide target option. So there wouldn't be any sort of state or regional allocation. There would simply be the coastwide recreational harvest quota. So we would look at the total coastwide harvest in comparison to our coastwide quota. Again, the goal would to be eventually establish a coastwide consistent size and vessel limit with seasons that could vary among the states. And again, the measures would remain status quo in each state until either the coast needs to take a reduction or until we have the next stock assessment. And just to sort of wrap up all of these allocation framework options, conservation equivalency would not be allowed for any of these allocation options. For the state-by-state framework, this already allows flexibility for each state to tailor measures, based on what they desire for their state. And then the regional or coast-wide framework, the objective here is to get to a consistent size and vessel limit for either the region or the coast. So conservation equivalency would not be allowed. And then the PDT had a couple just closing thoughts here on the allocation framework. Each of these types of frameworks, coast-wide, regional, state-by-state, do have benefits and challenges. The regional or coast-wide allocations could pool data into larger sample sizes to reduce uncertainty. But then, of course, you have the challenge of coordinating among states to come up with a consistent size and vessel limit. And then, of course, there are several underlying challenges that this board has discussed frequently, which again is high PSEs in general for cobia recreational harvest estimates, the seasonal migration, so you have different availability along the coast throughout the year. And also Atlantic cobia is a relatively new species under commission management. So the original FMP was implemented in 2017, and then we just transitioned to sole management in 2019. So it's only been a few years under this management. So that was, I promised, the longest section, 3.1. So moving on to section 3.2, this is regarding future updates to allocation. So option A would be status quo. Any changes to allocations would have to go through the typical addendum process. The alternative here is option B, where allocations could be changed via board action, so simply a board vote, but only for two specific scenarios. Those scenarios would be one, if a state loses de minimis status and therefore needs to be factored into the allocation calculations. So the allocation framework, the data we're using for allocation, that would all stay the same. We would just need to factor in that additional state that needed their own harvest target. And then the other scenario where the board could change allocations via board vote would be if the allocation source data were updated. So for example, if MRIP makes any changes to their estimates over the next few years. So the next section, section 3.3, is on data and uncertainty. So in this section, option A is status quo, which is we will continue to use up to a 3-year rolling average when we evaluate harvest against the target. And this is an average of up to 3 years under the same management measures. Option B, the alternative here, is using up to a 5-year rolling average for the evaluation. And this would be an opportunity to incorporate additional years of data since landings can really vary from year to year, and knowing that we have high PSEs in some years. Another feature of this section on data and uncertainty is a confidence interval provision, which would be a part of this section of the addendum. So if the board chose a regional or coast-wide allocation framework, this provision would allow the board in the future to decide if the board wanted to switch from a rolling average approach to a confidence interval approach for harvest target evaluation. So we would be looking at the confidence intervals around the MRIP point estimates. So this would allow the board to more directly account for uncertainty around these point estimates. The reason this is not a specific option right now is in order to do this, we need region-specific confidence intervals and PSEs, and those are only available via custom data request through MRIP. So we're hoping to have those before this document goes out for public comment. But this provision would allow the board to have time to sort of digest that information on the region-specific confidence intervals and take this up in the future if the board wanted to switch to this approach. So how this would work is instead of using rolling averages, we would evaluate the harvest target relative to the 95% confidence intervals around each of the MRIP point estimates. So if the confidence interval has been above the target, that means that states would have to adjust their measures back down to the target. If the harvest target falls anywhere within those confidence interval bounds, then the region could stay status quo. And then if the confidence interval has been below the target, then the region could liberalize to the target. And any years with very large confidence intervals and years with a PSE greater than 50 would not be included in the evaluation. And then any years with PSEs between 30 and 50 would be evaluated by the technical committee. And just a reminder, this provision would only be applicable to a regional or a coastwide approach. The PDT didn't feel comfortable proposing this for the state-by-state approach because some of the state confidence intervals are quite large. So as I mentioned, this provision is currently included in the draft addendum in this section. So no matter which average option is chosen, this provision is there and the board could switch to the confidence interval approach. If the board was more comfortable with framing this as an option instead, it could be, status quo, we have no provision. Alternative would be we add this provision. So if the board didn't feel comfortable with having it in there as part of the addendum right now, we could frame it as an option. The next section is section 3.4. This is overage response for any recreational landings evaluations. So currently status quo, if a state or a region exceeds their target, they have to reduce down to their target. The alternative here is if a state or region exceeds their target, a reduction would not be required if the following criteria are met. So if another state or region is below their target and that state or region has chosen not to liberalize, and if the coastwide harvest has not exceeded the coastwide quota. So if those two criteria are met, the state or region that is over would have the option to just stay status quo instead of taking a reduction. And then the final section here is the timeline for setting measures. Currently, the board can set specifications so that total harvest quota for up to 3 years. The alternative would be setting specifications for up to 5 years. So this would potentially reduce the frequency of management changes and also better align with when we have new cobia stock assessments. So that's all the options. I know that was a lot the PDT put forward, and I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. Thanks for that, Emily. Thanks for a very clear, concise overview of the document. So I want to open up the floor now for questions for clarity. And remember, our task is to winnow this down if possible as a public comment document. So if we can kind of keep that in our forethought here. So Shanna, I saw your hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to stop for a second and say thank you so much to Emily and Chelsea and the PDT. I listened in on their deliberations and I felt like we kind of just threw a task at them and said, we don't know how to do this. Can you figure it out? And they really did. I think this document is incredibly strong. And I was really impressed by the way you took the time to explain everything. I think it's a really good document. My question is in relation to the provision on the use of the confidence intervals. I was just wondering, so under like what circumstances essentially would we be able to implement the approach? I know you're saying that there's not the ability currently for us to get to those confidence intervals regionally without putting in a specific MREP data request. Are we just kind of waiting for that to like appear on the website? Or I'm just wondering what kind of triggers the board to say, okay, now we can consider the confidence interval approach. Thank you.
So we actually have already submitted a data request for the region-specific confidence intervals and PSEs. So we should have those in hand very soon. So if the board move forward with this addendum and the addendum has this provision, anytime after the addendum is approved and we have that information, the board could consider whether or not you wanted to switch from the rolling average approach to the confidence interval approach. So if the board approved this addendum in August and we have the region-specific, confidence intervals in hand, the board could also immediately, take action to implement that confidence interval provision. The goal is to have hopefully the data in hand over the next few weeks and hopefully include it in the public comment draft as an appendix to look at the PSEs for those different regions. So it's up to the board, how quickly, if the board wanted to wait to consider this confidence interval approach, with the next assessment, for example, or wanted to switch to the confidence interval approach right away, it would be up to the board.
All right, and Chris Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Emily, for going through the document. It's very well done. I think covers everything we need to consider. Just so I'm clear, under the regional allocation options, if that was chosen, the states would maintain their state by state regulations until the next assessment, right?
Correct. So right now, measures vary among most states. So size limits across states are pretty much consistent, but the vessel limits are different for almost every state. So that's right. If the board chose a regional approach, all of the states would stay status quo until the next stock assessment, so for a couple of years. However, if we move forward with the regional approach, later this year, we would have to do a regional evaluation of how the region's harvest compares to their new regional target. And if that region needs a reduction, then we would have to immediately switch to a new consistent regional measure. However, if the region didn't need a reduction, then things would stay status quo until the assessment. So it's either we stay status quo until the assessment, or we have to change right away if that region ends up needing a reduction.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris, because I think that's very important that we clearly understand the sequencing of how those things work. I mean, we're trying to put reasonable sideboards on it, but give ourselves some flexibility to adapt to the circumstances we're facing here. So, Lynn.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. And if it's okay, I now have two questions. So the first one is about the confidence limit approach. So practically, if we were to switch to that approach, does that mean that states would be in a position where they may have to update measures each year since we're no longer doing the average?
So that's a good question. No, so it would be on the same timeline as our current approach, where we're only doing those evaluations and potential management changes every few years whenever we have a new total harvest quota.
Okay, thank you. And then the follow-up is about Chris's question. So the states would, in a region, would maintain status quo measures, but if an upcoming evaluation showed they needed a reduction, the answer was the states would immediately have to move to a consistent measure. And my question is a little bit about the definition of immediate. So like, when does the evaluation occur and when would the consistent regulations have to be implemented? I just want to understand if that's within states' abilities to act.
Yes, that was a great point of clarification on my end. So if the board were to select a regional management approach and approve this addendum in August, this addendum would dictate what the measures would be for 2025. So between the August and October meeting, we would do the regional evaluation. How is each region doing relative to their target? If a region was over their target and required a reduction, we would come to the October meeting with proposed measures for that region to then implement in 2025.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remember that we don't get finalized MREP estimates until this time of the following year for the previous year's estimates. So we're always going to be sort of behind, and which is an unavoidable reality that we're facing here, that, we just now got the approved final 2023 estimates. So you're going to deliberate at the end of that year for what happened the previous year to set the following year. So, okay. Doug?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Emily, thank you for a good, clear, understandable document for me at least. And you really brought out some great points, particularly around FES estimates and high PSEs, which to me sort of make the entire process we're going through questionable at the moment, especially since some of this could change after the FES report is finalized, or the potential there is. And so I have great concern with taking this out to the public beyond this meeting, particularly with some of the large cuts that the southern states will take and where those cuts go. So at the appropriate time, I think I'm close to making a motion to tabling this until the FES report is done. With that said, I do have a question for John, and I realize we can't, Emily, you can't anticipate every scenario, but there was discussion about if we go with a regional approach that PSEs get considerably better, and John has a way of describing things to me to help me understand better. When I look at North Carolina through Georgia and the incredibly horrible PSEs that range from 33 to 92, I realize additional trips and that tighten those up, but do we really see getting out of a yellow zone? Do we get below 30, would you think, by pooling those three states' estimates?
Yeah. I mean, that's maybe, but you know, given what you see for the individual states, it does make you question whether or not putting them all in there. I think it would come down to just, you know, are the states at all similar? If they're all really variable and not really similar to each other, then you may end up in, you know, basically the same boat. You are putting some more observations in there, which probably brings it down some. You know, it may bring some of those 90s down to something more reasonable. Does it bring the majority into the green zone is harder to say. Yeah, you'd really have to do it to be sure, because you guys know this MRIP stuff is, you think you know what's going on, but until you run the numbers, it's really hard to guess how it's going to all work out.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the PDT did acknowledge that grouping the states into regions could provide some improvements, but the magnitude of those improvements are unknown. So hopefully we'll have the data from MRIP on these, our custom regions, to understand how much the PSEs would improve. But the PDT noted, you know, while they might improve a little bit, this won't solve the problem of uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think it's great to see getting away from the 3-year average, or at least looking at alternatives, because you know, that's good if things are just kind of noisy, but more or less correct. But, you know, we know with MRIP, the challenge is always the spikes that people don't think is necessarily legit. So then, you know, in the 3-year, 5-year moving average, you live with that over the time period. That's one of the reasons the council moved away from those, because we have so many uncertain species that are rare events, and they tend to be really spiky. And they go from 0 to 100,000 from one year to the next. But so I think the confidence interval is a step in the right direction. I just wonder, when the other method that's come up in the, you know, MRIP evaluations of rare events is looking at multi-year estimates, where they would take, you know, the total of observations of MRIP over, say, 3 years and generate a single estimate from all of those observations. And I just wondered if the PDT talked about that. And of course, it does add some complexities, because depending on how you calculate that period, you may have an even greater lag in when you know, get your actual estimate that you're going to use to judge the fishery. But it does seem to be a more robust place, and it wouldn't put the board in the position of trying to decide, okay, what confidence interval do we actually want to use as well?
So yeah, the PDT did not specifically look at that alternative approach, just the average and the confidence interval. And I just want to also remind everyone, the confidence interval approach would only be applicable to a regional or coast-wide framework. The PDT didn't feel comfortable proposing the confidence interval approach for a state-by-state framework, because some of the state confidence intervals are very large.
Yeah, I think we're all facing an uncomfortable reality here with the data we've got, and until we go to some different alternative than MRIP, something like Virginia's done, we're going to be facing the same situation. But even that has got its own problems. So, you know, it seems like we're sort of trapped in a world of imperfection. So, any further questions, John?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Emily. I guess I've got de minimis on the brain because of our close call with Spot yesterday, but just curious with the 5% set aside, it looks like if we do go with state by state with de minimis, that there are 5 de minimis states now And theoretically, they could exceed 5% and remain in de minimis. So first question is, what happens if that does happen and they exceed the 5%? And then just curious, with some of the other measures, there would be no de minimis, correct? Like a state in the regional or the coastwide would have to just adopt whatever the default regulations are.
Exactly. So the way the FMP is currently set up with the state-by-state allocations, there's no evaluation of or repercussions if the de minimis states in total exceed their set aside. So there's not a formal, if all de minimis states exceed their set aside, there's no repercussions in the FMP. I assume, that was set up that way. I mean, de minimis states are so variable in their landing, so there's no formal evaluation of the de minimis states against their target. The set aside is simply there to sort of try and account for the variable landings in those states. So you're right. Theoretically, each de minimis state could exceed 1% in a year and will have slightly over the 5% de minimis in a certain year. But the PDT felt that, there might be a few years like that, but largely the 5% should be sufficient for now to account for that. And then correct, if we move to a regional or coast-wide framework, the de minimis status becomes somewhat irrelevant, because right now de minimis states have the option to implement a slightly less restrictive size limit. But in the regional or coast-wide framework, the de minimis states would simply have to adopt whatever the rest of the region is adopting. So the de minimis status becomes a little bit irrelevant.
Yeah, it's hard to have payback provisions for something you probably won't catch. That's kind of an odd situation. Chris, and then I'll go to Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, on that point, Emily, I guess where de minimis still has some status in a region, if a region had to take a reduction and it was decided that a seasonal, shortening the season was the way to meet that reduction, and that was handled through the non-de minimis states, since the different states can have different seasons, then that would be a scenario where the de minimis states could actually maintain the regulations in that region. I just want to make sure I understand that correctly.
Yeah, so you're talking about the scenario where if we, like later this year, we move to the regional approach and a region needs a reduction, and it turns out that if only a couple states in that region were to take a season change, you could just meet that reduction and stay status quo. That's an interesting scenario. The objective of the regional approach is to at least get on the same page with the size limit and the vessel limit. So I don't think, as written, we could only change the seasons and go from there. I think the regions would need to get to a consistent size and vessel limit, and then the seasons could still vary.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I probably should have been more clear on kind of the scenario. I guess I'm kind of thinking ahead where the states did align their size and bag and vessel limits, and it came time for a reduction. That an option could be for the non-de minimis states to take the reduction through a season, changing their season, and leaving the de minimis states to maintain what they already had.
Yes, absolutely. In the future, if the states in a region decided, all right, just a couple of our states are going to change their season and everyone else can have their same season, that would be up to the region. Absolutely.
All right, Joe.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for the hard work. I agree this is a pretty solid document, but not following it that closely. And it kind of is, my question then is following on Chris's, a little bit more of an understanding of the exploration of conservation equivalency. There's actually a lot of us sitting around this table now. There's a lot of states, and the idea of coastwide measures where there's only, say, one state with a V that continuously having these large harvests, to think that we're all ratcheting down on regulations and trying to explain to folks, that there is no CE when we do it with so many other species. Just curious how that, didn't end up in this.
Yeah, I think that's just sort of the inherent difference between the state by state approach or even the region approach versus the coastwide approach. It's, if the state by state approach gives the states the flexibility to change their measures, and have different measures, but in moving to a coastwide approach would have that added challenge of just looking at everything from a coastwide lens, like looking at harvest from a coastwide lens, management measures from a coastwide lens without getting sort of into the state by state. Is this state up, but the state's down? We would just be switching to that coastwide perspective.
I'll follow up because then I think I'm almost embarrassed. So I think what we would then be explaining to the public is if you do believe that, then that state by state approach is the way that we should be handling. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any more questions for clarification, Ben?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to pile on, thank you to the PDT. Really a lot of work went in and appreciated that. Definitely want to echo some concerns from Doug regarding PSEs. Obviously, I don't know if that's going to change anytime in the future, but on the flip side of that, don't want to stick our heads in the sand completely, but not sure if there's any merit to looking at when some of these regional numbers might come through in the next few months, if that's going to change anything drastically. I don't know if we feel that is a possibility, question one. And then also just for my clarification, and Lynn, thank you for pointing that out. And sorry for slowing the uptake, but so if changes get made in 25, then requirements for states to take action would have to be within that same year. Is that correct?
Yeah, so if the addendum is approved in August, or even if the board pushed the addendum one meeting cycle and approved it in October, I think it would be up to the board. But if the board wanted to implement for 2025, that evaluation would occur at the end of this year, 2024, to figure out what changes to measures would achieve the reduction. And then if the board felt that a 2025 implementation date was feasible, the board could decide to have those measures implemented in 2025. So it's really up to the board as far as implementation date and sort of how that would work. But sort of the fastest timeline would be if the board approves this addendum in August, the evaluation against the targets happens between August and October. And then at the October meeting, the board decides what the 2025 measures will be. As I mentioned, the board could, if the board pushed this one meeting cycle, the board would then be approving this addendum in October, and then potentially would be looking at an evaluation and figuring out new measures in January 2025. And I think it would be up to the board to decide if we approve new measures in January 2025, is that enough time for states to implement for the 2025 season or not? So that would just be something the board would have to think about.
Shanna?
Thank you. So that brings up another question. Since there's talk of tabling, what happens if this document is tabled into the foreseeable future? What can we expect to do this fall?
So yes, great question. If this addendum is tabled, or if the board sort of runs out of time to do the evaluation and measures for 2025, the board, right now, the board has only set measures for this year, 2024. So the board needs to do something for 2025. So that could either be this addendum is approved and we're using the new addendum to figure out 2025. It could be the addendum is approved, and we do the evaluations, but the board, perhaps as they did last year, request the TC look at the impacts of just staying status quo for one more year, and the board could consider that. Or the board tables this addendum for a few years and we just use the current process we have, which is those state-by-state evaluations and our current targets. So either way, the board has to do something for 2025. Whether that is using this new addendum or not is up to the board.
I think that's the fundamental question that this board needs to decide right now is, there's no need of going into the details of this addendum right now if there's not the collective will to proceed down this course of action in some form or fashion, depending on how the addendum was modified. So at this point, I'd welcome a motion so that that question can be asked and debated and decided. So, Doug?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would move that draft addendum 2 to amendment 1 be tabled until such time as the FES report is presented, the final FES report is presented to the commission, at which time we would resume deliberation of this addendum.
All right. Do we have a second for that motion? Is that a question or a second?
Well, I'll second just for discussion purposes, but isn't that a motion to postpone rather than table?
Yeah, it's probably the proper Robert's Rules of Order procedure.
Well, I mean, there's table to time certain, right? And I guess it's not a time certain, it's FES report, but semantics.
Yeah, I think we don't know when that report's going to be produced, so we really don't know what that time is. For one thing, it puts it kind of out there into infinity. But if you say postpone, tabling is different than postponing. Postponing would say until a future meeting. So you want to change that to postpone?
Certainly.
Okay. So John, you still willing to second that as is stated for purposes of discussion? Okay, so we had some hands pop up. We raise the hands again. Whoever, I think Lynn, I saw Lynn, and then who else? Okay, I got a hold on. Let me get a whole list of this. I've got Lynn, Shannon, Chris, and who else? Raise your hand again if you want to comment on I got you, Chris. Okay, all right, go to you, Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is not a comment specifically on the motion, but there was a memo. I don't think I'm talking out of school. There was a memo released talking about the timeline for the time series of calibrated catch and effort estimates being available for incorporation into stock assessments no later than spring 2026. So I just wanted to provide, I think there is starting to be a little bit of a timeline coalescing around when these estimates might be available, and it looks like it'll be in the early part of 26.
All right, so that's when the results, they're projecting to have the results of the more expanded study, and then they're going to have to incorporate that into some sort of recalibration process, which would probably take another unknown period of time. So realistically, you're probably looking at 27 before you'll have revised catch estimates for us to argue about. So, okay. All right. Just so everybody has a time frame here, what we're talking about is postponing possibly into 2027. So at least 2 more, possibly 3 more fishing seasons under status quo. So that's what we're dealing with here. So, all right, I've got Shanna, and then I'll go to Chris Bat-Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Obviously, I'm going to speak in not support of this motion. I feel like this is something that we have discussed now at every meeting, at each part of this process, and the board has been asked this question several times if they want to continue to move forward with this document. I think the document was put together extremely well, and I think it outlines a lot of the positive influences that could be made by changing to regional approaches. We're facing issues with de minimis states falling in and out of de minimis. We're facing issues with overages in areas where we know that we really can't stop the fish from going to anymore. We're in a place right now where we recognize that we're probably not going to get those FES numbers until 2027 at this point, and we get those calibrations, and then how long into the future until we're actually able to implement them. I just can't sit by and say that we're going to wait this one out. It's essentially just sticking our heads in the sand and pausing absolutely everything just because we know this is coming, there's a very specific portion of this addendum that allows those numbers to be changed without us having to go through an addendum process, where if this addendum did not go through, it's my understanding that we would have to go through another process to change all of those numbers, and we'd end up back here again doing this again. So for me, I'm not going to support this motion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chris. Matt Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm also in opposition of postponing this. Kind of basically said every comment that I was going to say. It's the one thing I'll add is, I think we've learned that MRIP is an iterative process. They, continually kind of check their methodologies, and we get changes to the estimates over time. This will be the fourth one? I'm losing track. So the one that they're working on now probably won't be the last. I think we're just this is just the environment we're working in as far as managing recreational fisheries. So I think we need to move forward with the items at least that won't be as impacted by any new FVS calibrations that are in this addendum that we know are a problem. So yeah, that's why I don't think we should postpone this. Thanks.
All right, I'm gonna ask John Carmichael just to make another brief comment, just to clarify what our expectations are of the timing of the FES study results and recalibrations and so forth. So everybody will have that before we make a decision.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment and thank you, Spud. There was a recent NOAA fisheries guidance on the FES that went out to a whole bunch of people. And in that, they say that they anticipate having what they call tentative recalibrated estimates in spring of 2026. With the timeline they normally put out, the 2025 estimates, they'll have those recalibrated. They're doing the comparison this year and then the analysis in 25 and then in 26. But as we all know, that things are always contingent, and there's a number of contingencies about getting reasonable results and being able to trust the comparison and being able to develop a recalibration process. And of course, it's always with if considered necessary. So the earliest you'd be getting anything that you could look at numbers would be spring 2026. And then any changes would go in probably in 2027 to the program overall.
All right, thanks. Doug?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I heard stick your head in the sand twice. And so I guess I prefer kick the can as opposed to sticking my head in the sand. But I think the realities of the issues that FES faces are enough for me to say I don't want to take anything that's in 3.1 out to the public. I can't see North Carolina taking the cuts that it's planning to take, or South Carolina or Georgia, which 1%, but taking the cuts based on something that we acknowledge is potentially flawed up to 30 or 40%. I like options between 3.2 and the rest of the document. I think we could discuss those, but to me, that's why I'm opposed to moving forward is everything that's in 3.1 and the reallocations is there, which is at the heart of the document.
All right, thanks. Any other discussion on the motion? Well, I'm going to give us a few minutes to caucus before I call the vote on this, because we do need to dispense with this, and because we only have about 30 minutes left and we got a lot more to do. So I'll give you everybody, let's make it 3 minutes of caucus. Okay, is everybody good on caucus? I need a few more minutes. Everybody good? Okay. Well, we have a motion before the board. I'm just going to read it again to make sure everybody's clear. It's moved to postpone draft addendum 2 to amendment 1 until such time the final MRIP FES report has been presented to the commission. All those in favor signify by raising your hand. Okay, anybody? I guess there's nobody online. Everybody's represented here. So we have 2 yay votes. All right. Opposed, like sign. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What's that? 7. Got that. All right. Abstentions. All right, we got 2 abstentions.
So 4 and also Noah online.
Okay, so 3 abstentions. Null votes? No null votes. All right, motion.
Who's the other abstention?
It's John,
Oh,
John,
so
yeah.
thank you.
So Council Noah and Florida abstain. All right, motion fails. 2 to 8 to 3. All right, so now we can proceed with further deliberations on the draft addendum. I have a sense that probably where we need to do our work, most importantly, is going to be on 3.1. So let's, I want to open up the floor on that. We had a recommendation from the PDT about the 3-region approach. So I'm assuming that the board would probably be interested in supporting that recommendation. So Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm actually going to make a more simplified motion, I think, first, and then we can start to have discussions about the regions. The motion that I want to make is move to remove the timeframes for the weighted 10-year and the weighted 3-year averages from the document. And those would be options B3, C3, C6, C9, and C12. And if I get a second, I'll speak to that. Thank you.
Do we have a second for that motion? Second from Lynn Fagley. All right, let's get this up on the board, make sure we're clear. Okay, is that accurate, Shannon? Is that okay? All right, so we've got a motion and a second discussion on the motion. Shannon, would you like to provide some rationale for your motion?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My rationale for this motion is, again, we're trying to simplify the document. I think that we're continuously talking about how we need longer time series averages in order to more accurately understand what's going on in this fishery. I think that the second weighted option, which is the 10-year and the 5-year average, the one that we're currently using just with updated years, I'd like to see that one continue forward in the document, since that also seems to be, working for everyone. But I just don't see there being a big difference between the 10-year and the 3-year and the 10 and the 5. And I think that it's just easy for us to kind of try to whittle down some of those options and keep a more stable average time frame. Thank you.
All right, we're going to go back to that slide just so everybody can see the time series we're talking about deleting from the document. So everybody's clear.
There we go.
Okay, there we go. So any discussion, questions for clarification on this motion? Anything online? Anybody online?
Nope.
Okay. Any need to caucus on this motion? Don't see anything. So any opposition to this motion? Okay, don't see any opposition to it. Anything, I guess nobody online. So, okay, with no opposition, then we'll consider that motion approved, and that'll be deleted from the draft document. Okay, so any other recommendations on this particular part of the document with the time frames? Everybody satisfied with that content? All right, and we'll move on to the next part. And we can just flip to that next slide if we can, where we're talking about the regions. We'll move to the regions. We do need to answer the question of whether or not where North Carolina goes. And I know some of you have strong feelings about where North Carolina should go, but we're not going to, that's not what we're talking about. Okay, so we had a recommendation from the PDT to delete what would be in essence a de minimis region. So, Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to go with the PDT recommendations after talking to some of the de minimis states. So that would be removing any of the options in the document that are comprised of 3 regions. That would be option C4, C5, C10, and C11.
We have a second for that motion. All right, Jesse. All right, we've got a second. All right, any need for discussion on that motion? We had a PDT recommendation, pretty strong. I think it's pretty clear. That we'd end up with unintended consequences from that choice. So, any opposition to that motion? All right, seeing none, we'll consider that approved. So,
Spud, I think we might have altered the language just a little bit, just to make it very clear.
all right, let me read that in.
Which options were being removed from which sections. If you just give us 1 second, we can
Okay.
write the section in there.
Yes, I'm gonna read it into the record just to make sure it's clear. Move to remove any of the options considering 3 regions from section 3.1, which is C4, C5, C10, and C11. A motion by Ms. Madsen and second by Jesse Hornstein of New York. And again, just to make sure we're clear, any opposition to this motion? All right, seeing none, that motion's approved. Okay, we're making progress. All right, now we'll get to, we're down to 2 region options, and do we want to leave in what's in there regarding North Carolina being included with the, I'm gonna call it the North region or the South region? Just leave those 2 like they are for public comment. Okay, everybody's seen some heads nodding, so I think that one's good. So, okay, that's good. All right, any other sections of this document? Everybody's comfortable with what else has been presented in this draft document? Clear on what it means? Think it's going to be clear to the public what it means when we take it out? Think there needs to be any modification of any of the language to make it more clear? All right. At that point, and I think we're ready to approve the addendum as modified for public hearing. Okay, would someone like to make that motion? I got a motion by Lynn Fagley and a second by John Clark. So it's moved to approve Atlantic Covia Draft Addendum 2 for public comment as modified today. Motion by Lynn Fagley, second by John Clark. Any opposition to that motion? We got one nay vote. So, Doug.
And that's with all due reference to Dennis's comment this morning. I still feel like I need to vote my conviction, so.
Okay. All right. So we dispense with that. Thank you. Thank y'all very much. And we'll move forward with that. And we'll go to our second item, or 5th item actually, which is presentation of the Spanish mackerel white paper. So Emily.
All right, so thank you, Chair. I will provide an overview of the Spanish mackerel white paper prepared by the newly formed Spanish mackerel technical committee. I don't have time to cover everything in the paper, so I'll just try to hit a few of the highlights. So just a little bit of background. This task emerged from the board discussion about the need to better understand each state's Spanish mackerel fishery in anticipation of future board action to address state and federal management differences, and also recognizing emerging fisheries at the northern end of the species range. All states from Rhode Island to the Florida East Coast have declared interest in this fishery, except for Connecticut and Pennsylvania. And there are some management differences between the Commission's interstate FMP and the federal FMP. So the board has been discussing these differences and anticipates some future action. So in August of last year, the board tasked the technical committee with developing this paper to characterize Spanish mackerel fisheries along the coast. with the intent of helping the board address state waters management issues. So thanks very much to each state who submitted a fishery profile with a lot of detail on their state fisheries. We really appreciate each state pulling that information together. So first, the TC noted that Spanish mackerel availability along the coast is driven by water temperature and their seasonal migration. So the Atlantic coast stock spends the winter off the east coast of Florida, then they move northward to North Carolina in early April, and then further north in June. And then the fish move back down to the east coast of Florida again for the winter. So the majority of harvest across both sectors really reflects the seasonal migration. So the majority of Florida's harvest occurs from late fall through winter and then into early spring. And then from Georgia up until around Virginia, you start to see that majority of harvest in early summer as those fish move north. And then up further to Maryland, up to Rhode Island, you see the majority of that harvest start to appear in sort of late summer. So looking at the combined commercial and recreational landings in pounds by state over the past decade, you can see the recreational sector shown here in green has accounted for the majority of harvest in most states, except for Florida, where the commercial fishery shown in blue has accounted for about 55% over that time period. And you can see that in addition to Florida, both Virginia and North Carolina have targeted directed commercial fisheries. So the commercial proportion is a little bit larger for those two states as well. And for those commercial fisheries, again, only those three states, Florida, Virginia, and North Carolina, have directed commercial fisheries for Spanish mackerel. Over the past decade, Florida has accounted for about 75% of coast-wide commercial Spanish mackerel landings, North Carolina for about 22%, and then Virginia for about 2%. So just for a little perspective on scale, in 2022, Florida had 436 participants in the Spanish mackerel commercial fishery, and the average landings ranged from about 300 pounds per trip in 2022 to about 600 pounds per trip in 2021. North Carolina over the past decade has had an average of about 374 participants, and they average landings about 220 pounds per trip over the last decade. And then Virginia has had about 50 to 100 participants each year over the past decade, with an average landings per trip ranging from about 30 to 200 pounds over that time. And then the remaining states in the management unit, all combined, account for less than 1% of coastwide commercial landings over the past decade. And these state fisheries, commercial fisheries, so Georgia, South Carolina, and then from the Potomac River north, these are all opportunistic bycatch commercial fisheries. So there's variable landings from year to year, with average landings less than 100 pounds per trip, and only a handful of participants. The vast majority of commercial fisheries are occurring in state waters. All three states with directed commercial fisheries, so Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida, indicated that over 90% of their commercial landings are from state waters in recent years. And there are a variety of commercial gear types that are used. In Florida, hook and line and cast net are most common. In South Carolina, trawl is the predominant gear. That's just for their bycatch fishery. And then for North Carolina north, gill nets and pound nets are the most common gear types. So moving on to the recreational fishery, recreational hook and line fisheries occur in all states, although South Carolina and many of the northern states indicate that the recreational fishery is opportunistic and not necessarily targeted. Over the past 10 years, Florida, again, has accounted for a majority of landings, 44% of the coastwide recreational harvest. This is in numbers of fish. North Carolina has accounted for about 32%, South Carolina 14%, Virginia 7%, Georgia 1%, and the remaining northern states for about 2%. The majority, again, of recreational fisheries are occurring in state waters. There are a few exceptions that were noted. New Jersey noted that about 55% of their landings have been from state waters, the other 45 from federal. Delaware noted the majority of their landings have been from federal waters. And then South Carolina noted that although the MRIP data indicate a majority of their landings are from state waters, their charter logbook data indicate that a majority of charter trips are actually in federal waters. And just a couple other points on the recreational harvest estimates. The TC noted that there are pretty high PSEs for some states, particularly for some of the states at the northern end of the range, and also for Georgia in some years. The TC did note there is an increase in effort in several states from 2020 to 2021, potentially associated with COVID-19. And then looking at the recreational harvest by mode, in most states, the private and shore modes comprised over 90% of recreational harvest. In Virginia, that was a little bit lower. Private and shore comprised about 81% of recreational harvest in the past 10 years. And so addressing the board's interest in any trends at the northern end of the species range, it appears that landings in the more northern states have been generally higher for the past 4 years as compared to the prior several years. However, the landings are still pretty variable and the trends can differ state to state. So up on the screen here, you'll see the commercial harvest for those states at the northern end of the range. So on the left, you have the dashed line on top is Rhode Island through Delaware. That sort of dotted line underneath is Maryland and PRFC. And on the right, you have Virginia. Note that the Virginia scale is much larger than those other states. But you can kind of see that the past few years, the landings have sort of stayed at on average, a bit of a higher level than those past several years, with a very large spike in 2019. And then on the next slide, you'll see the recreational harvest. This is in numbers of fish. That solid line is Virginia, the dashed line is Maryland, and then the dotted line is Rhode Island through Delaware. So again, you can see sort of a spike in 2019 and landings on average staying a bit higher these most recent years, but still sort of in the grand scheme of things, relatively small compared to some of the other states. And then just to finish up here, the TC pointed out a couple of points specific to the Florida Spanish mackerel fisheries. So Florida, for both sectors, typically contributes a large proportion of landings, but there has been a recent decline in 2022. So one factor that this board discussed in last year's FMP review was that there are increased areas that are closed off to vessels to create safety zones associated with space launches. So this has prevented access to traditional fishing areas for Spanish mackerel in Florida. And then also a note that Spanish mackerel concentrate in easily accessible and inshore areas during the winter in Florida. And this has resulted in some conflict between the commercial and recreational sectors because they're operating simultaneously in the same areas. So that's all I have. That's just a quick sort of highlights to the white paper. You know, I'll say this TC task was in response to the board's interest. So if there's something, any edits or questions that you have on the white paper, please feel free to reach out to me and we can post the white paper on the website in the near future.
Thanks, Emily. And thanks to all the states for responding with the information. This will be an important source document as we move forward and trying to sync up state management of Spanish mackerel with federal management. Any questions for Emily? If not, I'm going to turn it over to John. Well, go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, great report, Emily. I appreciate going through that thoroughly and letting everyone know about the different Spanish mackerel fisheries in each state. I just wanted to point out, I don't think it necessarily needs to be in the document, but that the U.S. Coast Guard is implementing a new tool called the Space Operations Launch and Recovery, which stands for SOLAR tool, which is like an online app that people can go to look at where different zones might be closed for upcoming launches to better plan their trips. So hopefully with the implementation of this tool with the U.S. Coast Guard, that this might help with the limitations caused by on the fishery from those closures. But more to come on that.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. If there's not any other questions, I'm going to turn it over to John. Give us an update on council activities.
Yeah, thank you, Spud. And I want to update you on the port meetings, long awaited. We had the first kickoff round in North Carolina a few weeks ago, and it was really a resounding success. Everyone was very pleased with the turnout. We had about 150, 160 folks across 4 meetings, pretty evenly spaced as well, hit 4 different spots along the coast of North Carolina. That's great turnout for meetings where you're not proposing a bunch of cuts and controversial management measures. And the feedback gathered at the meetings was really good. Had great conversations between, the fishermen and the staff there, and got a lot of good feedback about the fishery. But I really want to highlight the support that we received from North Carolina DMF to make these a success. There are 2 staffers in particular, Kevin Hamon and Amanda Masick. They just really went above and beyond in terms of a real personal grassroots approach to reach the fishermen and those involved in the fishery, calling individuals. I think Kevin called every tournament operator in the state and said, hey, these are coming up. You need to come out and speak. So, just want to stress with the ones that are coming up, we'll really appreciate the help from the other states and the commission as well. If you can get a hold of the people that are involved in the fishery and interested in it, then I think we can continue to get great turnout at these meetings. And, just show it's a good way to go out and talk to the fishermen and get input when you're not going out with controversy and just getting everybody that wants to, tell us our data are bad and we shouldn't be managing, but really have good discussions about where the fishery needs to go. And, the council is going to use this input to then decide where the next amendment actually goes in terms of dealing with Spanish and addressing the issues that are out there. So the next round will be come up. They're doing a series of virtual meetings in New England, May 14th through 16th. And this was anticipating that there's going to be lower interest than up there because, the fish are not as common and not as traditional of a fishery, but there may be some interest. So that'll be virtual. And then there's going to be a meeting in conjunction with the Mid-Atlantic Council meeting in New York the first week of June. And, so as the different states come up, of course, our staffer, Christina Wagon in particular, will be reaching out to coordinate with you guys and make sure we're doing everything to get the word out. But just really want to stress, we've seen the social media posts and newsletters and that sort of thing, the broadcast approach, not necessarily bringing out people, but to the extent you can get out and really, touch base with the folks that are engaged in the fishery and interested in these issues are likely to make it a good success. And we had a lot of North Carolina staffers and others that came to the meetings too, and that was also really beneficial. I think they got a lot out of talking with the fishermen themselves. So very encouraged by how this has kicked off and hope it continues.
All right, thanks, John. Yeah, it's quite an effort, but I think it's going to yield some very important outcomes, mainly the fact that just getting out and interacting with the people that are affected by our decisions so that they know that there's real people with real concerns and real interests behind all this magic and voodoo that they see. So any questions for John about the port meetings? Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, John, for going over that. For the New England webinar hearings, are those webinar links posted just in case myself and any other board members just might be interested in hearing perspectives from the fishermen up in the New England states?
Yeah, I anticipate they'll be posted on our website with all the information about it. Yeah, certainly we put them there so people can get ready access.
And I can send them around to the board as well.
All right, Jay?
Yeah, so I think maybe this was just said, so sorry, but we're happy to help do some work up in Rhode Island to drum up some participation. So just let me know when the virtual meetings are, and we'll echo that out on our communications and all that good stuff too.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. And I think Christina's listening. So Christina, reach out to Jason and make some contacts there. That'll be helpful.
All right, thanks, John. We didn't have any other business identified at the beginning of the meeting. Is there anything anybody would like to address under other business this time? You have 2 minutes. Yes, Emily. Yeah.
So switching gears back to COBIA for this COBIA draft addendum that has now been approved for public comment. If you'll just look out next week for an email from me asking you all if your state would like to have a public hearing so we can get those scheduled. Thanks.
Okay, any housekeeping, Bob or Tony, before we break? All right, there's no other business to come before the Pelagics board. We will stand adjourned.